we're going to touch upon a lot of things, the things I just listed, for example. But first, we have to begin with Israel, because that is what it all comes down to. At the end of the day, the entire evangelical edifice, the entire evangelical system of eschatology revolves around, as it should, Israel. And you can make a case pretty easily that the entire biblical message, indeed the entire gospel, revolves around Israel. But I want to argue in this introductory talk that the way that Israel is understood by virtually all evangelical people, whether they're pastors or lay people, is incorrect. And so I want to do some preliminary stuff first by way of what's called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics might be a term that you're not familiar with. It comes from the Greek god Hermes. He was like the messenger boy or whatever. I'm not Greek mythology is my Achilles horse, so I get it wrong sometimes. But if I'm not mistaken, Hermes was the guy with like wings on his heels, and he'd fly around and tell people stuff or something like that. And so hermeneutics refers to the interpretation of texts. Okay, any text, not just biblical text, but Shakespeare, Plato, Aristotle, Homer. Anytime you're engaging in the discipline of seeking to interpret a text, regardless of what that text is, you're doing hermeneutics, okay? And so how you do your hermeneutics is obviously going to color and, in some sense, drive the conclusions you arrive at, right? And so if your hermeneutics are wrong, if your way of seeking to interpret key concepts and words and ideas is wrong, then your conclusions are going to be wrong. I remember reading C.S. Lewis years ago. I think it was in his book Miracles. I read this back in the 90s when I was living in Europe as a missionary, where he talked about, if you're doing a math problem and, long division or something super like detailed, and you make a mistake somewhere along the way, you can't just keep going and just let it correct itself eventually. Once you make a mistake, you have to stop and go back and fix that mistake, or else everything that subsequently comes will be wrong, right? And so that's the case with hermeneutics. When your science of interpretation, or the principles that guide how you seek to understand texts, is incorrect, then any conclusion that you derive from those texts will likely also be incorrect. And this isn't, I have a little cheat sheet here, a little outline, but this isn't in it, but it does bear a little bit of attention, and especially when we get to the millennium, the so-called 1,000-year reign of Christ, this will come back into play. But I should mention it at the outset. If you pick up any book on biblical hermeneutics, how to interpret the Bible, one of the main things you're going to hear about is a principle that says that you ought to interpret unclear passages in light of clear ones, right? And so if you've got, as you have in the Bible and elsewhere, you've got all kinds of different sort of genres of writing, right? You've got poetry, you've got prose, you've got historical narrative, you've got wisdom literature, you've got prophecy, you've got apocalyptic literature. The best example of that is the book of Revelation, the final book of the New Testament, which many early church fathers thought should not even be in there. Like, this thing is nuts. Like, what? We shouldn't have this in here. This is wild. And if you ever read it, it's pretty wild. But Revelation's a good example of apocalyptic literature, which by its very nature is metaphorical and illustrative and figurative, right? It's not the same kind of writing as, and then Jesus went from Capernaum to Nazareth, and then Paul got in a boat and went to Crete. Like, that's historical narrative, right? And that functions in a certain way. And I think instinctively we know this. I think instinctively we know that when you're reading something like poetry, you don't take it literally, right? You don't seek to just take all poetry and make it literal, because that's not the way poetry functions. Poetry functions, it conveys ideas, but it conveys them in flowery, poetic language that has a lot of, decorative flair, right? Revelation is like that. in the book of Revelation, Jesus is depicted, sometimes as a sheep, as a lamb that's been slain, sometimes as a lion, sometimes he's got, 7 eyes, and he's got, got these 7 crowns on his 7 heads. The whole thing is like that, right? The beast that rises out of the sea, and the false prophet. Everything in the book is that sort of apocalyptic, figurative kind of language, which distinguishes itself from prose, from historical narrative. It's not that I'm saying these are different. Anyone who reads them will know that it's different. It's different reading a history book versus reading Shakespeare, right? The genres are different, and so the way you approach them ought to be different. It should respect the kind of genre that you are engaging with. And so in hermeneutics, you interpret unclear passages in light of clear ones, right? And so you don't start with the most just crazy figurative, metaphorical text and say, this is going to be our baseline, and we're going to go from there. But instead, you start with what's clear. And then you get to the stuff that's a bit more challenging, and you seek to understand it in light of what you've already derived from clear narrative or prose or didactic sort of teaching, right? And so I hope that's not too controversial. I don't think any evangelical would disagree with that, at least not when they hear it said like that. They don't do it. They disagree with it in practice constantly, and we'll get to that. But that's just a basic principle in hermeneutics that applies across the board. And I hope it makes sense, and I hope it's not too, controversial, because it doesn't seem like it should be.